Men whispered about him, men feared him. Men carried his name like a curse, because they all knew the truth buried beneath the ashes of a ruined plantation. A boy had destroyed them, not with a gun, not with a blade, but with secrets sharper than steel and vengeance colder than the riverbed silt beneath his feet. And as he slipped deeper into the bayou, away from the smoke and the screams, one question hung in the night like a noose tightening around anyone who dared to ask it. How does a boy become a force capable of breaking grown men? Before we descend into this cinematic retelling, do me one quick favor: hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our deep dive story documentaries. It helps more than you know. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing the map light up with all of you. Alright. Settle in, adjust your headphones, and let's step into the shadows of a world built on fear, secrets, and a boy no man could ever control. The dawn broke hard and red over the marshlands, and a young boy stepped into the light like he'd been carved from the night itself, his silence unsettling every man who dared notice him in passing. Men said he walked differently, moved like he expected danger behind every rustling reed, and though his frame was slight, there was a steadiness in him that made grown workers glance twice before speaking. He arrived without belongings, escorted by a rough-voiced driver who offered no explanation, only a curt nod before leaving him at the edge of the plantation where the cane whispered secrets in the wind. Every man present sensed something strange in the boy's stare, not cruelty or fear, but calculation, as if he weighed each face, each voice, each heartbeat, filing them away like tools for later use. His name was Jonah, given reluctantly by the driver, though it felt more like a warning than an introduction, carried on the humid air with an uneasy finality none dared question aloud. Jonah spoke little during his first hours, answering questions with clipped phrases that offered no insight into who he was or where he'd come from, yet somehow revealing far more than silence should allow. The overseer, a tall, scar-cheeked man named Ward, assessed the boy with suspicion, for he'd seen dangerous intelligence before, and Jonah's quiet was not fear but observation sharpened into something lethal. Even the field hands, hardened by years of punishing heat and back-breaking work, sensed that Jonah was not a child to dismiss. He watched the world with an adult's caution and a hunter's intent. When he walked past the bunkhouses, men felt a chill despite the choking heat, because his gaze landed on each doorway as if searching for weaknesses instead of simple shelter for the coming night. Jonah chose a bunk near the far corner, away from the lantern light, a spot usually claimed by older men, yet no one protested when he sat down, spine straight, hands folded, eyes unreadable. The day settled into its usual rhythm, metal striking dirt, voices rising and falling, yet Jonah absorbed every movement around him, noticing patterns of authority, fear, resentment, and small bold acts hidden in plain sight. When Ward barked orders, Jonah didn't flinch like the others. He simply watched the overseer's boots, his stride, the way his hand hovered a moment too long over the whip at his hip. During the midday break, Jonah sat alone beneath a twisted oak, listening to men gripe about ration cuts, stolen tools, and whispered threats, storing every fragment as though each word carried weight. Some men muttered that Jonah was unlucky, that he carried misfortune on his shoulders the way other boys carried dirt, though none could explain why they felt uneasy near him without sounding foolish. Jonah's first display of uncanny awareness came when he warned a worker named Hale to shift left moments before a rotted beam collapsed behind him, sparing the man a broken spine or worse. Hale stared at Jonah with wide, disbelieving eyes, but the boy offered no explanation, only a slight nod before returning to studying the pattern of shadows drifting across the yard like shifting omens. Rumors spread quickly among the men, weaving Jonah into conversations like a thorn no one could ignore, and each retelling grew sharper, painting him as a boy touched by knowledge no child should possess. By evening, Ward summoned Jonah to the porch of the main cabin, demanding answers in a tone meant to intimidate, but Jonah met his glare without flinching, unsettling the older man deeply. Ward asked where the boy learned to move so quietly, and Jonah replied that silence was easier than speaking, for speaking let people measure you, but silence let you measure them instead. The overseer felt something tighten in his chest at those words, a warning his instincts recognized, though he couldn't yet explain why a 13-year-old boy felt like a threat he couldn't fully predict. When Jonah returned to the bunkhouse that night, men eyed him with a mixture of respect and unease, as though he'd crossed an invisible line none of them had ever dared approach. A storm rolled in after sundown, thunder shaking the wooden walls, and in the flicker of lightning, men swore they saw Jonah awake, watching the storm, as though listening for messages hidden in the thunder. The boy didn't sleep much, turning his attention instead to the patterns of rainfall and the distant shouts of night guards, mapping the plantation in his mind with frightening precision. Before dawn, he was already outside, barefoot in the mud, studying the overseer's schedule, the guards' routes, and the weak points in the fence lines where vines concealed rotted wood. Men approached him hesitantly, drawn by curiosity, but Jonah answered each question with minimal words, shaping his reputation not with aggression but a quiet certainty that demanded caution from others. By midday of the second day, Jonah had already earned a place in the unspoken hierarchy of the laborers, not through strength or experience, but through a presence that felt older than his years. Ward tried testing him again, ordering him to lift more than his slight frame should manage, yet Jonah obeyed without complaint, moving with an efficiency that troubled the watching men. When Jonah stumbled briefly, a worker named Finn reached to steady him, but the boy regained balance before contact, offering a brief glance that made Finn step back with an apology. The men began whispering that Jonah saw more than he should, that he anticipated movement, danger, and intention before they manifested, making him seem almost prophetic in the dim afternoon haze. At dusk, Jonah walked the fence line alone, tracing each weak plank with his fingers, memorizing the structure with the same unsettling patience that had defined his quiet arrival hours earlier. Ward watched from the porch, uneasy, sensing that the boy wasn't simply curious but evaluating the place the way a strategist sizes up a battlefield before the first strike is ever considered. Jonah paused beneath the oldest oak, staring toward the distant marshlands, where fog rolled in low and thick, and something about his posture made even the bravest men keep their distance. The boy whispered something no one quite heard, a sentence swallowed by wind, and though no meaning could be taken from it, the tone carried a promise of change neither gentle nor slow. When the lanterns flickered that night, men exchanged glances, half joking that Jonah's presence unsettled the air, yet none truly laughed, for each felt an unease they refused to voice fully. Jonah lay awake again, listening to breathing patterns, footsteps beyond the thin walls, the occasional cough, and the shifting of wooden frames as though every sound was another piece of a puzzle. Ward patrolled late into the night, but each time he glanced at Jonah's bunk, the boy's eyes were already open, watching him with a calm that frayed the overseer's nerves. By the third sunrise, Jonah was no longer an outsider, but an anomaly embedded in every conversation, every suspicion, every uneasy glance exchanged between men hardened by years of survival. And beneath that rising tension, one truth whispered through the plantation like a coming storm: Jonah was not here to endure this place. He was here to dismantle it, one man at a time. The heat settled thick over the plantation as Jonah stepped into his second week, moving with a confidence that made men study him from the corners of their eyes, unsure whether to fear or respect him more. Whispers followed him everywhere, carried low between bent heads, men murmuring about strange instincts he possessed, how he sensed danger before it surfaced, how he seemed to read intentions the way others read weather signs. Even Ward, whose reputation for authority had gone unchallenged for years, found himself watching Jonah too often, disturbed by the boy's calm stare that held no dread of punishment or hierarchy. Jonah used that attention strategically, revealing nothing, offering no emotional openings, allowing every man to fill the silence around him with whatever legend suited their imagination and deepening uncertainty. In the cane fields, stalks rustled like restless ghosts, tall enough to hide secrets if someone moved with purpose, and Jonah often disappeared inside them with a quiet speed unnerving to the watchers. Men whispered that he spoke to the cane, listening for warnings, though none dared enter after him, because anyone stepping into that dense green maze felt swallowed by something older than their courage. Jonah traced narrow paths he memorized after a single glance, gripping soil, noting texture changes, mapping every weak root and hidden dip as though the field were a living creature revealing its vulnerabilities to him. He returned each time with information no boy should know, predicting when sections would collapse, when snakes nested beneath rotted stalks, unsettling the workers who depended on instinct rather than uncanny precision. Hale avoided Jonah now, uneasy after the boy's earlier warning, because gratitude had faded quickly into suspicion, and he feared being observed by a child who understood him too clearly. A group of older men tried testing Jonah's patience by blocking his path, tossing crude remarks, but he walked between them without blinking, leaving them silent as though their hostility never registered. They complained later that Jonah's indifference felt like judgment, a quiet dismissal that cut deeper than confrontation, making each man doubt his own importance in ways no insult could achieve. Jonah spent evenings watching patterns of torchlight move across the yard, noting how guards rotated, which man lingered too long near the water barrels, who checked shadows twice because fear lived behind his sternness. Ward sensed tension building but couldn't trace its source, because nothing Jonah did was overt. Yet everything he did adjusted the quiet mechanics of power that held the plantation together. A dispute erupted between two workers one humid afternoon, fists flying, both men claiming stolen tools, but Jonah stepped between them with unexpected authority, forcing silence with a single steady glance. The men backed away, embarrassed that a boy's calm held more weight than their rage, realizing too late that Jonah never raised his voice yet still dismantled their anger. Ward reprimanded the fighters, but afterward he confronted Jonah, demanding to know why he intervened, though the overseer's frustration masked a deeper fear of losing control to a mere child. Jonah's reply was soft, almost casual, stating that unnecessary noise attracted the wrong eyes, and if Ward valued order, then avoiding needless chaos mattered more than bruised pride among restless workers. Ward left unsettled, because Jonah's tone wasn't rebellious, just observant, and the logic behind his words gnawed at any man used to power rooted in dominance instead of intelligence. The men grew wary of Jonah's presence, avoiding conversations near him, fearing he overheard everything, because secrets that once felt harmless now carried risk when a silent boy listened too intently. Jonah used their caution as leverage, shifting subtly between groups, weaving an invisible net of information as branches snapped in distant cane fields, echoing like cryptic messages. He observed which men shared alliances, who harbored quiet resentment toward Ward, who hoarded rations, who stole moments of rest, collecting human patterns with the precision of a seasoned strategist. Rumors intensified after Jonah predicted a minor accident involving a wagon wheel, which shattered exactly where he'd warned, deepening every man's belief that the boy saw danger before it formed. When night fell, Jonah walked alone along the fence, pausing at broken slats, tracing rusty nails, examining footprints where one man had stolen away for solitary thoughts, learning the plantation's secret rhythms. The men inside the bunkhouse watched through thin wooden cracks, muttering that Jonah didn't fear the dark because the dark seemed to bend around him as though recognizing a familiar presence. Jonah returned only after midnight, sliding into his bunk without sound, prompting startled glances as men realized he could move without disturbing even the creaking boards beneath his weight. By morning, every whispered conversation carried tension, men worrying that Jonah evaluated them constantly, measuring their flaws, though they couldn't understand what he planned or why he bothered. Ward began sleeping with a lantern lit, troubled by dreams where Jonah stood silently at the foot of his bed, though he knew the boy never entered the overseer's cabin. Jonah noticed the exhaustion in Ward's posture, the faint tremor in the man's hands as he gripped the whip, and he stored that detail like a sharpened tool waiting for the right moment. Tensions escalated further when a worker named Brand accused another of stealing a pouch of nails, but Jonah stepped forward, revealing their location with unnerving accuracy, forcing both men into stunned silence. Brand demanded to know how Jonah figured it out, but the boy simply shrugged, saying patterns always leave traces if someone bothers to look where others refuse. The argument dissolved instantly, with both men shaken by the boy's insight, leaving Jonah neither praised nor trusted, suspended between awe and dread in their conflicted minds. Ward watched from the loft, realizing Jonah exerted influence unintentionally, or so it seemed, yet the overseer sensed that nothing this boy did was ever truly accidental. The field workers began stepping aside instinctively when Jonah approached, not from fear of retaliation but from the unsettling feeling that he perceived every weakness they carried. And beneath every whisper and sideways glance, a single truth swelled like an oncoming storm: Jonah wasn't just learning the plantation. He was bending it, quietly, expertly, one man at a time. The air hung unnaturally still as dusk settled over the plantation, a heavy quiet that made even seasoned men pause in their work, sensing something shifting beneath the surface of their daily routine. Jonah felt it too, not as fear but as confirmation, because patterns he'd watched for weeks were aligning, creating the kind of pressure that made men break without realizing who pushed them there. Ward barked orders with an edge sharper than usual, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, and the other men noticed how his hand trembled each time he reached for the whip. Jonah watched from the corner of the field, noting how authority faltered when a man's mind splintered, and he recognized Ward was nearing a breaking point he could exploit without lifting a finger. As the sun lowered, shadows stretched across the cane, turning each stalk into a dark blade, and Jonah slipped between them, moving with a purpose that made the plants whisper around his path. He paused in a clearing he'd studied for days, crouching to examine the dry piles of discarded husks left by workers, knowing the right spark here would spread faster than any man could contain. Jonah didn't light anything, he didn't need to, because he had memorized who snuck cigarettes, who discarded embers carelessly, and which exhausted worker would unknowingly trigger the chain he'd shaped. Back at the bunkhouse, men argued over short rations, voices rising, chests heaving, each convinced the other had stolen food, though Jonah had merely rearranged supplies to deepen mistrust. Tension built like steam trapped beneath iron, and Jonah watched from his bunk as two men nearly came to blows again, this time requiring 3 others to separate them before Ward intervened. Ward stormed in furious, shoving men aside, shouting until his voice cracked, yet every outburst revealed cracks deepening in his control, widening with each passing hour. Jonah noticed the sweat along Ward's temples, the rapid flick of his eyes, the unsteady breath behind his rage, signs of a man losing ground beneath his own feet. Near midnight, a distant pop echoed from the cane fields, faint but sharp, and Jonah glanced toward the bunkhouse window just as a small glow flickered beneath the swaying stalks. A careless ember from a worker's smoldering cigarette had landed exactly where Jonah anticipated, igniting the dry husks he'd observed, spreading low flames unseen by all but the night creatures. Jonah stood quietly, saying nothing, allowing events to unfold with the inevitability of a storm cresting after weeks of pressure building, each moment shaped by simple human nature. Minutes later, someone shouted fire, and men scrambled instinctively, grabbing buckets and rushing toward the fields, panic spreading faster than the first thin line of smoke rising into the dark. Ward sprinted ahead, yelling commands, but chaos drowned his voice as men tripped over tools, shouting conflicting orders, creating confusion Jonah had predicted down to the breath. The flames caught a pocket of wind and surged upward, tall and violent, turning the cane into a wall of fire that roared with hunger, crackling through the field like living fury. Jonah moved with the rushing crowd but kept enough distance to watch how each man responded, who panicked, who froze, and who blamed the wrong person in the confusion. The blaze illuminated Ward's fear as he realized control was slipping beyond his grip, and Jonah noted every fractured expression, every desperate command ignored by men who no longer trusted him. As the fire spread toward the storage shed, a worker named Darren screamed at Ward for ignoring earlier repairs, and Jonah saw the argument erupt with violence fueled by weeks of resentment. Darren shoved Ward, who retaliated with a wild swing of his whip, but exhaustion dulled his aim, and the crack missed, escalating their fight into something reckless and unrestrained. Other men joined the chaos, shouting conflicting accusations, blame flying in every direction except the one that mattered, never once landing on the boy watching with quiet focus. Jonah slipped away from the crowd, walking toward the main barn where he'd earlier loosened a latch, ensuring the doors would swing open when the fire reached the structure's edge. When the flames touched the dried haystack near the entrance, the barn exploded into bright pillars of heat, sending embers swirling upward like fiery insects scattering into the wind. Shadows of panicked men danced across the yard as more structures ignited, each collapse punctuated by shouts, crash, and the sickening realization that nothing could stop the fire now. Ward stumbled toward Jonah, blood on his lip, rage twisting his face, shouting that the boy must have known something, but before he reached him, another man pulled him back, blaming him for everything. Jonah backed away calmly, watching the overseer struggle against the men restraining him, their anger too intense for logic, their fear too loud for explanation. The night sky turned orange, smoke billowing upward in thick spirals, and the plantation became a battlefield of shouting workers, collapsing walls, and blazing debris scattering across the dry ground. Jonah stepped near the edge of the yard, his silhouette outlined against the inferno behind him, every flicker of flame reflecting in eyes that held neither guilt nor excitement, only certainty. He observed Ward's final attempt to regain control, the man climbing a water cart to shout orders, but his voice cracked, drowned by the roar of fire and the rising chaos among terrified men. When the cart toppled from heat-warped wheels, Ward fell hard, his authority crashing with him, and Jonah knew the overseer's rule had ended not with defiance but with inevitability. The last structure to collapse sent sparks sailing into the night sky like dying stars, each ember drifting before fading into darkness, marking the slow death of everything men once believed stable. The flames eventually calmed, settling into glowing heaps of ruin, and Jonah stood before them with a stillness that unnerved the remaining men, who whispered about curses and fate under their breath. By dawn, the plantation lay in smoldering fragments, smoke curling into the early light, and the men looked at Jonah as though he'd summoned the fire himself by simply existing. Jonah walked through the ashes as though he had expected every outcome, leaving footprints between glowing embers, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the collapse was only the beginning. The morning light crept across the bayou as Jonah stepped from the last remnants of smoke, his feet sinking into wet earth while the men behind him whispered his name like something dangerous they had accidentally awakened. He didn't turn back toward the ruin, because backward held nothing useful, only charred beams, broken loyalties, and the ghosts of men who'd clung to authority without understanding the power of a quiet child watching everything. Jonah moved toward the waterline where mist curled around cypress roots, drifting like pale fingers reaching for him, yet even the swamp seemed hesitant to touch a boy who had outgrown fear entirely. The surviving workers gathered in a loose circle, unsure whether Jonah was a lie or omen, their eyes darting between the smoldering horizon and the child, who walked with unsettling certainty through devastation he never physically caused. Hale approached first, knees shaking, asking what Jonah planned now that everything had fallen, but the boy offered no clear direction, only a cryptic murmur that not all endings required answers to be understood. Ward was gone, carried into the blaze by his own unraveling, and Jonah sensed that men like Ward died twice, once in fire and once when their authority failed beneath the weight of silent truth. Jonah studied each survivor with measured thought, recognizing their fear was no longer of the fire but of what a child could do without touching a single match or whispering a single threat. He stepped past them toward the marshy trail that wound north, and though no one dared follow closely, several men shadowed him from a careful distance, drawn by instinct more than trust. The swamp thickened ahead, buzzing with insects and distant splashes from creatures half seen, but Jonah walked as if guided by an invisible map, confident where grown men hesitated to place their next steps. He paused at a fallen tree that bridged two banks, scanning the horizon where smoke drifted faintly upward, and he understood that destruction was only the first step toward severing himself from everything familiar. Jonah crossed the log with careful balance, reaching the other side before glancing back to see men debating quietly, torn between safety in numbers and fear of following a boy who unsettled their beliefs. He didn't call them forward. Instead, he waited until one finally joined him, stepping tentatively across, his breath trembling as though he feared the boy might vanish and leave him lost forever. Jonah welcomed him with silence, appreciating loyal instinct more than spoken allegiance, because words were fragile currency, yet actions revealed truths men rarely admitted to themselves. More men followed, each crossing as though walking from one life into another, and Jonah watched how their decisions shaped the path better than any plan he might create alone. The swamp deepened, heavy with humidity thick enough to cling to skin, but Jonah led without fatigue, absorbing every detail of shifting terrain with the precision of someone trained by hardship. He scanned the treetops and waterline constantly, noting where alligator slides cut through mud and where roots formed natural footholds, guiding the men with unspoken expertise they couldn't begin to question. When they reached a clearing of bent reeds and shallow water, Jonah signaled them to rest, the only gesture suggesting he cared for their strength despite the distance he kept emotionally. Men drank quietly, their breaths synchronized like soldiers recovering after battle, and Jonah watched them not as burdens but as pieces of a shifting future he hadn't fully named yet. He walked toward the water's edge, feeling mud swallow his steps, studying his reflection, which looked older than his years, shaped by firelight, memories, and choices men would never have dared make. The men behind him murmured that Jonah seemed changed, as though the blaze had burned away the last fragments of innocence, leaving a boy shaped entirely by observation and sharpened intent. Jonah crouched near the reeds, listening to frogs and distant splashes, recognizing that the world outside the plantation was vast, unpredictable, and full of men who relied on assumptions instead of clarity. He understood this uncertainty was power if used correctly, because men who didn't understand him couldn't control him, and he intended never again to be shaped by another man's hand. As the sun rose higher, the group continued north through twisting trails where shade cooled the air, and Jonah adjusted their pace to avoid exhaustion without making it appear like mercy. When one man stumbled, Jonah paused briefly, offering no words, Only a look that encouraged the men to rise, learning strength from necessity rather than comfort. Hours later they reached higher ground, where moss hung from branches like draped banners of forgotten battles, and Jonah sensed this was a place they could plan their next move safely. The men gathered around him, forming a circle without being asked, waiting for direction they feared yet strangely trusted, because Jonah was the only one who'd seen collapse without breaking. He told them they were free now in the simplest terms, not celebrating it but stating it as fact, because freedom meant responsibility, not comfort, and he expected them to understand that immediately. Some nodded eagerly while others shifted uncomfortably, realizing freedom required decisions, and decisions required courage they had rarely been allowed to develop under another man's authority. Jonah studied them, recognizing which were ready to follow and which would eventually walk away, and he accepted that leadership wasn't chosen, but inherited through necessity. The sky dimmed slightly as clouds gathered overhead, and Jonah knew they needed shelter before rain turned swamp paths into treacherous rivers, pushing them deeper into danger than they could endure. He led them to a ridge where fallen branches formed natural cover, and while the men strengthened the structure, Jonah sat apart, planning their next days with cold clarity. He understood they would soon face decisions about where to travel, who to trust, and how to navigate a world built by men who valued control over compassion. Jonah's thoughts stretched far beyond survival. He envisioned towns, camps, roads, and borders, mapping possibilities as easily as he once mapped king fields and overseer schedules. When rain finally began to fall, the men huddled beneath the improvised shelter, glancing toward Jonah as lightning flickered, illuminating him like a figure carved from stormlight and intention. Through the storm's rumble, Jonah whispered thoughts of futures unbound by fear, not as promises but as quiet truths only the brave could claim. The men listened silently, understanding that everything they lost might be worth everything they were becoming, guided by a boy who refused to be broken. Jonah closed his eyes as thunder rolled overhead, recognizing that the world beyond the fire would challenge him, yet he felt no dread, only resolve forming like stone beneath his ribs.